Okay, hi. So I got a little excited and I decided to start Victober a month early. So this is actually my first year participating in Victober and I've already not done it properly, but the goal is to get people to read Victorian literature. So I think mission accomplished there. I still plan on participating in October. I'll go through maybe a little bit of my potential TBR for that at the end. But October is a busy month for me. My brother is visiting for 2 weeks, and we'll be doing a lot of fall-related stuff, so I won't have as much time for reading. So I decided to do it a month early, and I decided to kind of partner it with Shorty September, which is another readathon that is my first year participating. For both of them, I participated just in concept, not by doing any of the prompts. So I was motivated to do Victober for the first time this year because I have started reading Victorian literature a little bit more recently. I read Jane Eyre at the beginning of the year and really liked it. And then I went on to read a few others. I read The Tenant of Wildfall Hall and also really liked it. And so I decided I wanted to kind of peruse Victorian literature and see if I like it and what about it I like. So I kind of did this more as like a genre experiment. So I decided I was going to read from like different genres of Victorian literature. I understand that genre is something that kind of changes with social times in some capacities. And so like I was attempting to convey like a current standard of genres to Victorian times, which is not necessarily like a one-for-one. I had a few genres I wanted to try. I wanted to do fantasy because I really like reading fantasy. Wanted to see if like the kind of origins of modern fantasy in like Western modern fantasy are interesting to me. I wanted to try some sci-fi because sci-fi is also a genre I quite like. I like it for the social commentary aspects a lot of the time. I wanted to try horror. I also put mystery, gothic, adventure, and coming of age, all of which I did not get to. So let's start with fantasies. I read 2 Victorian books with fantastic elements to them. The first one was Alice in Wonderland. I've attempted to read this multiple times in my life, and I finally got through it via an audiobook. I don't know if I had a lot of strong feelings about this book. I found it to be very similar in a lot of aspects to the movie. I found it somehow, even though it was fairly short, to be quite repetitive in some aspects, in the types of things that were happening. Like Alice spends a lot of the book crying, and yeah, generally, even though it was a short book, it felt long. So I wasn't a huge fan. I'm also not a huge fan of that type of fantasy generally, where it's very nonsensical. So it already probably wasn't going to work for me. The second fantasy I read was The Princess and the Goblin, which was originally published in 1872. This is another one that feels like Alice in Wonderland, a little bit more catered to children, which I think is interesting because I wasn't specifically looking for fantasy catered to children, and I kind of wonder, is fantasy at that time catered to children because like the imagination was catered more towards children, because like anything not real was seen as nonsensical, or did I just happen to pick up 2 books that feel more catered to children than other books that might be fantastical in nature, that are more adult? Although I did read Carmilla, which I would say is fantastical in nature, vampires, but horror, so maybe that's the way that Victorian era saw the fantastic is like when you're an adult, it's through the lens of horror. When you're a child, it can be through the lens of a fairy tale. I don't know. I'm providing a lot of commentary for something I have no background or knowledge of besides these 2 books I've read. What I find interesting about this in the context of modern fantasy is that there is a whole subgenre of modern fantasy that are like fairy tales or like retellings of fairy tales. And we see that now more as like a part of the fantasy genre, whereas it seems like here that was the fantasy genre, was fairy tales in this time, at least in Western culture. So you have a young princess. I think she's like under the age of 10. I think that the book is a little bit of a misnomer, being called The Princess and the Goblin. I think it should have better been called The Princess and the Miner, because there is this character of the miner that she interacts with a lot, and I would say is like a more major character. The goblins kind of exist as a species, and you know some of them by name, but it is not the princess and the goblin. And I kept expecting like their two kind of storylines to merge a lot faster than they did because of the name of the book. Overall, because it was more catered towards children, it was much more of a light fairy tale. It didn't have a whole bunch of substance. I didn't love it, but I didn't dislike it. It was just a fine read for me. I will say that there's this really weird subplot of like the young princess needing to kiss someone, and like it was just like very strange and unnecessary. Okay, so then I read sci-fi. I read The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. This is my second attempt at an H.G. Wells. I had originally, a few years ago, attempted to read The War of the Worlds, and I found it very boring, and I DNF'd it. I didn't love this one either. I think that the meta aspect of the genre of sci-fi, though, is quite interesting, because to me, one of the most fascinating aspects of sci-fi is it really takes a lot of the time modern struggles or modern fears of what the future can hold, and it hyperbolizes them or has some social commentary about them, and it is a way of interpreting the world around you through a philosophic sci-fi lens. So from that perspective, I found it really interesting, because The Island of Dr. Moreau is about a man who gets kind of like shipwrecked and ends up making his way to this island where they're doing, and this is going to be a little spoilery, they're doing vivisections. I had never heard that term before. It's the practice of performing surgery or experiments on a living animal for scientific or medical purposes. But it takes that a step further, and it's trying to do experiments to humanize, in this book, to humanize animals. It's a critique on the concept of vivisection, but it also seems like it's questioning like what the future will hold, knowing Darwin's theory of the origin of species, and kind of grappling with those concepts. So there's a few things I didn't like about this book, and one of them, aside from the meta conversation, is just like the imbued racism in the book itself. It's hard for me to get over. Historically, Darwin's thought was used as a scientific means for backing up racist ideology, and that very much felt imbued in the text. I felt it from the very beginning with the way these like humanoid animals were described, but then it became a little bit more on the page as the book went on. It's interesting from a meta perspective of reading, but in terms of my enjoyment, it just felt very icky, and I didn't like reading those aspects. The other thing that I don't like is that I find H.G. Wells attempting to write action to be very, very boring. So I was actually much more engaged with the philosophical aspects of this book, even when I disagreed with the notions being put forward by the text. But the points where he tried to imbue action into the text were very dull to me. And I think that that's why I DNF'd War of the Worlds. I just found his action scenes so boring. It was like aliens were coming down, this guy's running for his life, and I felt like falling asleep. Anytime there was action in this book, I felt like putting it down. So I think that H.G. Wells is just not for me. I might be able to jive with more sci-fi at the time, but I think that I would just maybe appreciate it more from the meta lens of like seeing where thought was at the time and reading it more as like a thought experiment of, at the Victorian time, how people perceived where the world was going, as opposed to reading to enjoy the text itself. So I probably won't pursue those as much, though like I'm still open to it. Okay, and then the last one I read in the month was a horror. I read Carmilla. I'm going to talk about this in an upcoming video more, where I'm talking about all the vampire books that I've read recently. So that was more the reason I read this, but it was written during the Victorian time. So I wanted to include it on this list. Overall, I had a good time with it. I preferred it to Dracula. I like horror that is shorter. I like it to be atmospheric. I like the eerie edge to it at times. So for me, in its totality, it worked in those regards. I appreciated that it had female protagonists. I felt that they were written pretty well.
Another thing that I thought interesting about this text is that I found it to be kind of queer coded, not in the same way as the picture of Dorian Gray that I think is kind of a little bit more overt. And I wonder if this is part of where the allure of vampires comes from, or if I'm just reading into it a little bit more than I should.
Overall, I enjoyed it, but I didn't love it. In terms of like other genres I want to try, I had a few other horrors on my list. I had The Turn of the Screw. I tried to read The Turn of the Screw, but it just wasn't working for me at all. For mystery, I have a Wilkie Collins, so Moonstone or The Woman in White. I wanted to try to find a romance, but like I feel like maybe I've already technically read romances in the genre, given that I've read some Jane Austen, given that I've read some of the Brontes, and so I think that that's just what romantic stories looked like at the time. For fantasy, the other book that I do want to try is The Jungle Book. I'd be curious to hear like what other people perceive as other subgenres or other genres of the Victorian age, like looking through the Victorian lens. It seemed like adventure novels were kind of a genre at the time. So Treasure Island, Coral Island, those are things that I've considered picking up. I've kind of started Treasure Island, but I might just like soft DNF it. And then coming of age, I feel like is also a kind of genre of the time. Although I don't know if you would consider that a genre by a modern lens. And then I never know about Gothic. Like, is Gothic a genre or is it an atmosphere, or was it a genre at one time and now it is an atmosphere? I don't know. I'd be curious to hear people's thoughts who read many more Victorians than I do. So I feel like this experiment didn't totally hone in my reading tastes in terms of Victorian age books. I feel that the things that I have liked the most in the books that I just read were missing here. I feel like the humor of the Victorian times is what I'm drawn to. I love when a Victorian just puts someone down or puts someone in their place. The insults are top tier. I get a good chuckle every time I read one. That really felt missing from these texts. I also feel like I'm drawn to the conversations of social class and the delineation between social classes, which I don't really feel entered into any of these books. So I guess it's kind of helped me hone in on the things that I've liked in the other Victorians that I've read, but that doesn't really give me a good idea of where I want to go. So If any of you have suggestions based off of this video, based off of the things that I liked, based off of things I didn't like, I'd love to hear them and help that kind of inspire how I get more into Victorian literature. The main book I plan on reading in Victober is Wuthering Heights. And I know that people feel like one way or another about that book, but I do want to get through all the Brontes because I have enjoyed them. So I'm reading one from each, and then I'll go back through their very small collection of books that they have all written. Yeah, I'll chat with you guys about what I actually end up reading in the month of October for Victober. That is all I have, so until next time, happy reading.